At Professional Risk Management Services, our medical liability insurance program for psychiatrists and behavioral health group practices, the Psychiatrist Program, is designed to meet your needs throughout the various stages of your career. As a national psychiatry-specific program, a policy with PRMS can cover child and adolescent, forensic, early career, and military psychiatrists, as well as moonlighting residents and fellows, part-time practitioners, and telepsychiatrists. Learn more about how PRMS can protect you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for our third Washington Psychiatric Society podcast. I'm Hira Mahayuddin, a third-year psychiatry resident at the George Washington University, and I'll share a little about myself as we start this session. I'm passionate about advocacy, particularly for underrepresented populations, for equity in access and delivery of healthcare, and for parity for mental health services. To this end, I serve on the Legislative Advocacy Committee for the Washington Psychiatric Society. I also serve on the Human Rights and National Security Committee for the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. And I was recently elected as the American Psychiatric Association Deputy Representative for the Area 3 Council. I hope to pursue a career in forensic psychiatry, and so it is my distinct pleasure to introduce a national expert who has shaped and contributed significantly to this field, Dr. Raymond Patterson. Dr. Patterson has extensive experience in clinical, forensic, and administrative psychiatry. He worked in the District of Columbia Mental Health System as a staff psychiatrist, medical and forensic services director, chief psychiatrist of DC Jail, and commissioner of mental health. In Maryland, he was a superintendent of Clifton Perkins Hospital Center, forensic services director, and chief psychiatrist for the Department of Public Safety and Corrections. He was a consultant to the Department of Justice, correctional institutions, hospitals, community groups, and law enforcement organizations. As a court-appointed expert, he monitored mental health programs in numerous states and territories. He has published numerous articles and book chapters on correctional psychiatry, administration, management, and public health. He is a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and Forensic Psychiatry, and a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
My great pleasure, Dr. Moyadin, and we have a lot to cover perhaps in a very short period of time, so we'll do our best.
All right, thank you. I'll keep the rest of my introduction brief then, but for those of you who are new to our podcast, this series was spearheaded by Dr. Enrico Suardi as an extension of the Career Leadership and Mentoring Program, and serves as an opportunity for psychiatrists in training and early career psychiatrists to learn from experts in our field on various topics and to stimulate discussion, for which we will leave time at the end. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat during the session. And with that, I'd like to ask our first question. Dr. Patterson, you've held so many roles as a clinician, as a consultant for the Department of Justice, commissioner of mental health, among many others. Can you tell us about these unique roles and the evolution of your career?
Well, I will tell you, the time has flown by, frankly. I finished my residency in 1981, and that makes it 40 plus years that I've been doing this kind of work. So it makes me an old guy, and I'm fine with that. But I will tell you, when I first came to Washington, to Howard University College of Medicine, I was coming to be a cardiologist. Psychiatry was the furthest from my mind. And when I got, and I had an opportunity to rotate through old Freedman's Hospital before the new Howard University Hospital was built, which is great. But during the rotations, everyone was described by their disease or their problem. This is a 42-year-old woman with breast cancer. This is a 12-year-old child who broke his arm. And no one had names, and they didn't have lives. They didn't have histories. They didn't have families. So that attracted me. And I was mentored by Dr. Elise Galati, and to a lesser extent, Francis Welsing, and even Luther Robinson, who was the first Black superintendent at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And those are folks who just resonated with me, along with a number of other folks that trained me along the way. So I got into psychiatry, and then forensic psychiatry was fascinating. Why do people do what they do? How do people think? And I was at the John Howard Pavilion at St. Elizabeth's Hospital as part of a team I had two pretrial units, and that meant approximately 60 patients at any given time. And that was when St. Elizabeth's was several thousand patients, and John Howard itself was 270. The hospital currently is 300 beds total. So a lot has changed over time. But in addition, I gave a talk last year at the Apple meeting in Chicago, and my title was Before and After the Trial, because forensic, that part of psychiatry having to do with the law, that's what forensic is comprised of three basic components. One is criminal, one is civil, and one is juvenile. So juvenile forensics is a world all unto itself. It is very different rules and very different regulations than adult. Criminal adult is what most of us have run into, and sometimes with civil commitment to hospitals. It has to do with police bringing people in, so we get a touch of forensic criminal in that way. And civil forensics has to do with psychological injury, whether or not someone has PTSD from something that's happened to them, or whether or not someone has testamentary capacity for a will and leaves $2 million to their cat, and the whole family is upset and wants to know, were they competent to do that? As well as other aspects of civil. But in criminal forensics, there was no place better, if there is such a thing, to practice than in Washington, D.C., because at the time, St. Elizabeth's Hospital was owned and operated by the federal government, by the National Institute of Health. So it was both the state, quote, state unquote, hospital for the District of Columbia, but it was also receiving as the federal hospital for the nation. And as a seat of power, people came to the district, sometimes very sick, in order to get their views heard or to make their needs known. And sometimes they would end up with us at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And that's kind of how it started for me, and went on through administrative endeavors. And then that's the first 20 years before the trial. And then the second 20 years is after the trial. What happens when someone goes to trial? Well, they're either freed, they're not guilty, they are hospitalized if we and the court agree, or the jury agrees that they are mentally ill and in need of treatment, or they are placed in prisons across the country. In the United States, incarcerated per capita more people than any place else in the world, and disproportionately for people of color, for people who are poor, and in increasing numbers of women. So we are needed badly within both forensic in the broader sense of doing evaluations, et cetera, but also in the treatment sense of people who are mentally ill and who may have been involved with the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much for sharing more about your career and how we're uniquely positioned in Washington, D.C., and how the history of your time also at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Can you tell us how you've seen the field of forensic psychiatry change during your career?
Quite a lot. The field of forensic psychiatry, like psychiatry as a whole and like medicine as a whole, has changed with the advent of managed care and the way of managing how people receive care and how they can be involved with doctors and nurses and other care providers. So that's an overall overarching kind of change that's happened. But remember, I've been practicing for 40 years. And when I first went into jails or prisons, most of the time, the people running those institutions did not want to see me or people like me, because we were those, quote, do-gooder shrinks coming in to give people those drugs and get them off for what they did. And they saw us very much in that light. And during that time as well, medicine was, as a body, was failing what a good friend of mine who was incarcerated described as the fourth world, meaning that the docs who were practicing behind the walls within corrections many times could not practice anywhere else. They were under some form of suspension or some form of restricted license. So they weren't getting the best in many instances. Not to say that there weren't some great docs, but few and far between. And we were, meaning psychiatrists, guests in the House of Corrections. We were invitees, and we didn't have a seat at the table. And my good friend Jeff Messner says it very well, that we no longer are guests. We are at the table, and we have to be. And we have to be because of case law that has governed what rights inmates and people who are involuntarily held against their will and have mental health or other health needs are entitled to get. And those were all because of case law that has progressed through the years. And starting with a case that had nothing to do with mental health, Estelle v. Gamble, which had to do with someone who injured their back and they were ignored in the Texas Department of Corrections. And therefore, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that that was what was later to be defined as deliberate indifference, violations of the 8th and 14th Amendment. And that has driven, along with another case, Bowring versus Scotting, which is the companion mental health case back in the 70s, both of those cases that say that mental illness is as much a illness as any other illness and requires treatment. And that's why we have to be there. It's not an option. It is a requirement.
Thank you so much for speaking to the changes that have occurred historically to ensure that those who are incarcerated are able to receive medical treatment as well as mental health parity where possible in the correctional system. As you know, our patient population is overrepresented in the correctional system. And I'd like to ask what you believe is the role of a psychiatrist in decriminalizing mental health, such that individuals who need care are able to receive it and or diverted from the correctional system.
Well, if we start at the back end, as you said, the overrepresentation, the estimates of individuals who are suffering with serious and persistent mental illness in our prison systems, in most instances, is 20+% for men and sometimes 50+% for women, as compared to 12% in the general population. And the suicide rates in prisons and jails exceed the national suicide rates greatly. 12 national suicide rate, 17 in prisons, 30, 40 in jails. And suicide is the number one cause of deaths in jails. So we're talking about conditions that we may be able to intervene in and that we can help. That's at the back end of trying to provide treatment of people who are already arrested and are in the system. But before the system, and this is where our colleagues in child psychiatry, and particularly those in child forensic, are really, really, really incredibly valuable. And we need them. I frequently will say that to someone who has that kind of knowledge. Oh my goodness, you're the gatekeepers. I mean, you guys can many times intervene and try to do something that may prevent someone ending up later in our systems, meaning forensic systems, meaning corrections and carceral. And that's another term. Language is important. And we all know language is extremely important on how we refer to ourselves and how people refer to us. And you will hear many folks in the mental health professions talking more about carceral psychiatry or carceral mental health, meaning pertaining to prisons, but it gets away from the concept that corrections is correcting something. That may indeed be the intent in what was originally considered in corrections, but if you go into some of our jails and prisons, you know that's not what is going on. And it's very difficult to be able to tolerate some of what you see, but you also realize that but for your being there is no one. So it is important upfront. And that means in our school systems, you mentioned my being a commissioner of mental health for DC for a period of time. And during that, I made trips to the school systems. I wanted to talk to the kids and find out. I started with the high schools. And some of the time as I'm talking to kids, they're looking at their phones. And this is back in the 90s, early 90s. So we're not talking about, well, now everybody has a phone. We're talking about back then. So I thought, this is too late. So I went to the junior high schools and they some of the same kinds of things. So I realized it needed to be sixth, seventh, eighth graders that we're talking to about their mental health and how to deal with reality and how to deal with being disrespected or losing and not losing your mind because of it. So there's a lot we can do across the spectrum of what we do as mental health professionals, both psychiatrists and psychologists leading the way, I hope.
Thank you so much for sharing your work with our youth and how there are many opportunities for intervention at even very, very young ages. I'd like to ask more about your advice towards others. During your career, you've held many leadership positions and interacted with the media as well. What advice do you have for those who hope to pursue similar positions, and also those who would like to learn more about interacting with media outlets?
Well, as it turns out, how can I say this as delicately as I want to? Social media has risen as a true reality for all of us. So you cannot get away from it. And it's a question of what happens. And sometimes it can be very positive in the sense of it capturing something that might not have otherwise been captured, like George Floyd's death, for example. Otherwise, there are people in underserved communities, particularly Black community, brown communities, that know things like that have happened over the years. But it was very difficult for some other folks in white communities to believe that was true until they saw it in front of them. So there are things like that that are very helpful in that way. There are others where any time now that there is a mass shooting, whether it's at a school or it's in a hotel or it's wherever it is, much of what is first expressed by the media is, oh, and he had mental health problems, as if the violence must be connected to some type of mental health problem or issue. And that's sometimes the case, and other times it certainly is not. And whether or not it rises to the level of that individual being unable to control their behavior or unable to appreciate the wrongfulness, which are the standards that have to do with legal insanity, is a very different issue than someone had school problems or was going through a bad relationship and sought counseling. Those are different kinds of things. And that's where we as psychiatrists are critical in trying to sort that out for the rest of the world, because the way that it is fashioned sometimes is so skewed and without information. And since I've been in Washington, I've been involved with several high profile cases. And because St. Elizabeth's is St. Elizabeth's, of course, we received people who had attempted to assassinate a president. So I've had the opportunity to evaluate several of those folks, both while I was at St. E's and after. And I also have been appointed by judges to do evaluations in particularly high profile cases, and one including the 20th hijacker in 9/11, who survived, who was arrested before he could get on the plane that was coming from Pennsylvania. So those are kinds of things that come our way. But while I was involved with that, my phone started to ring from people saying, oh, this is AP, or this is UPA, this is so-and-so, this is a shock jock on W so-and-so and so-and-so, and you're live on the air. Things like that can happen to us. And we have to be very, very careful, very cautious about what we say, about what we're involved in, because there are rights, not just HIPAA considerations, but there are rights that people have about what has happened and what is happening to them. And you may be asked at some point in your career, come on a news show, as I have been, and give some information about something you know nothing about, except what the media has reported. That happened to me with the shotgun stalkers. And it was, I'm not the shotgun stalker, but with the guys who were Muhammad and Malvo, who were shooting at the DC snipers. And unfortunately, there was some information that was put out by a mental health professional saying, oh no, it's this middle-aged white man it was the classic serial killer profile, except it didn't apply to them. So we have to be careful. There are things that we know, And there's sometimes where we have to say, I don't know.
That distinction is so important, and thank you for sharing one of these very interesting cases that you've seen. Um, I wanted to ask, I know we have only a few minutes left before we open it for questions, but what do you think is the biggest challenge facing psychiatrists today?
Growing need for our services and decreasing numbers of us. And I see it across the country. Um, and COVID has exacerbated that even more. And I'm certainly in favor of telemedicine, telepsychiatry to a limited extent, but it does not replace the firsthand knowledge of what it's like to be inside of a jail or inside of a prison. And that's important for us to actually know, to actually walk through and feel what it's like to be in restricted housing or solitary confinement, to know that a suicide watch cell is essentially a barren cell, maybe with a camera in the corner that may not work, that feeds to a monitor that no one's watching. You don't know that unless you've actually walked through and felt what the temperature is. Is it cold? Is it obsessively hot? What is it like in a living condition? So I think those are the kinds of things that are really important for us to have firsthand knowledge as much as we can. But we also, and this is for the old guys like me, have to do as much as we can to encourage the young kids like you to come into what we're doing. Spend some time in a jail or in a prison. When I've been teaching, sometimes I'll ask the group, what's the most dangerous place you can think of for a psychiatrist to practice? And sometimes I'll get, well, maximum security or super max. Been to many of those. You know what it is? Your office.
Oh, wow.
Because in your office, you made an appointment with someone who's coming to see you, have no idea who they are, what they have, other than what they communicated to you, either in an email or on the phone. Whereas in a correctional or carceral institution, everybody is aware that there is potential danger here and potentially dangerous people. So I've, knock on wood, fortunately, have not been assaulted. I've not been gassed, mean having bodily fluids thrown on me and that kind of thing. But I treat everybody inside of an institution with respect. I don't call police officers or deputies guards because that's a derogatory statement from their perspective. I talk to inmates with Mr. or Miss. I ask them their names. I try to make sure I'm making that connection. When I'm talking to brass, meaning the folks who run the institution, I'm not talking down to them like I'm the doc and I can tell you what to do. No, I want to understand what you do and how you do it and what it is that you need from mental health to make this work better.
And that's very interesting and an important lesson for us to absolutely see the environments in which we're treating our patients. And I hope to do that in the future as well. One final question before we open it up to the rest of our listeners. What would you like your legacy to be for future generations of psychiatrists?
Well, when you added that future generation of psychiatrists, that changed my answer. My legacy is my family.
Mhm.
It's that's it. But in terms of future psychiatrists, I would like for them to have thoughts of people like me and other folks that are in their heads, and they can rely on that little thought coming back when they need it. It doesn't have to be a psychiatrist. And I'll tell you, one of them for me, I was trained by a surgeon named LaSalle D. LaFall. He was the chief surgeon at Howard University Hospital when I was there. And I had the best of both worlds. I did my internship in my first year of residency at Howard University Hospital, the Howard University Hospital. And I say that because it is the Howard. That's important. That for all you sports fans out there, when the football players, when they're introduced, the guys that are playing pro football and they say the U or college football, the U or the so-and-so or whatever it is they come from, Ohio State, whatever. For me, I have pride in where I trained. So it is the Howard University. And he was the trained surgeon. And I considered surgery for about that long, and I knew it wasn't for me. But he had a saying that any Howard graduate from probably 20 years will tell you equanimity under duress. It's in there. It's in there. And I've been on the stand sometimes. I've been sitting on the floor in maximum security, supermax, next to an inmate who can't come out the cell. He's on one side of the bars, I'm on the other. Equanimity under duress. It sticks. So I would like legacy that someone will say, Ray Patterson said, you know what? You can be the best doc that you ever could be if you just believe. You can.
Thank you so much. It's a valuable lesson for us all to carry forward and to hopefully emulate. With that, I will turn it over because we usually have very robust discussion and many questions. We wanted to make sure we left enough time to read through the questions left in the chat. So I'll start from the first one from Dr. Marcus Patterson and read that one out. Can Dr. Patterson comment on the role of collaboration? Oh, sorry, just on the role of collaboration with other disciplines and specifically the psychiatrist's role in the multidisciplinary treatment team in forensic and/or carceral settings?
I think I can, and I think I'm familiar with this particular doctor. Happens to be my son. Very proud of. That's part of my legacy too. But and it's an excellent question, and he knows that one of the things, because he grew up observing this, that was set me on the right course in my career was team building. When I first started working at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, it was the director of forensic services was a man by the name of Joe Henneberry. He was from Kilkenny, Ireland. He had a strong brogue. If you ever heard Joe talk, you know who he is. He was an RN by training, but he was an administrator. And he assembled the best team that I have ever worked on. I've assembled a few good ones myself, but that one included the chief psychologist, the chief social worker, the chief of rec therapy, the chief of alcohol drug, the chief of security, the chief nurse, all the chiefs. And we were essentially the forensic review board that reviewed everything that went to the court before the court saw it. But it was a great team. And I used to examine for the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, for the general boards, as well as later the forensic boards, when they had orals in the general boards. The forensic boards for APPN never had orals, but the general boards had orals. And one of the things over the years that I thought was concerning was that we would see psychiatrists knowing a great deal about biological psychiatry and medications, and very little about team building and actually their role as a part of the team. They could be the team leader, which is a role that is different than there being a psychologist, for example, or another discipline being a team leader, and you're in the role of a psychiatrist. They're different. But those are things that got lost. And some of them got lost in the managed care requirements that psychiatrists can't spend more than 15 minutes with a patient. So you got to see them, get the meds done. You're all right, you're not suicidal. Okay, next. This is not what we do. This is not how we should do what we do. And we can do that with other team members. We don't have to carry the whole load. We can't carry the whole load, and neither can anyone else. So it's a great question. And without teams, we fail, plain and simple.
Absolutely. Incredibly important as we have more advanced practice practitioners in our providers in our field, and working together in teams will be increasingly important in the future. Dr. Philip Candelas says, thank you for doing this. And in difficult budgetary times, how do we convince our political friends not to cut costs in public health where expenditures yield outsized benefits for vulnerable groups?
Yeah, Dr. Candelas is essentially my boss at St. Elizabeth's in the Department of Behavioral Health. So this is great. I love talking to folks that I know, but also folks I don't know. And that's such an incredibly complex problem and issue. When I am trying to negotiate about money with the folks who control the money, I try to talk to them about money. And it's hard for us to get away from, you need to do this because it's the right thing to do. You need to do this because our patients need to have this amount of service. When you start talking about money, and the money is, well, it will cost this much for us to do this, and it will cost 5 times that much to defend the lawsuit that we're going to get if you don't do this, from either an employee getting injured or someone, another patient, or someone receiving care, whether it's in an institution or in a community, that we could have seen coming and done something about. Those are the kinds of big ticket items that sometimes people will start to hear. But it is very hard. And I will tell you, one of the most successful times that I've had in trying to get a court to understand why the court had to order a system to do more than they were doing was to invite the judge to come into the jail with me. And the judge came with me. And the day I went by myself, there was one deputy on a suicide prevention unit with multiple patients. And that one deputy was supposed to be doing, I'm not sure what. When I came back the next day with the judge, there were 8 people on that unit, 8 staff. And I said, you know what, Your Honor, this ain't how it was yesterday. And we walked that unit and we looked around and we saw where there were objects that could be used to injure oneself on a suicide prevention unit, things like that. And he saw right through it. But that's the kind of connection that can make it happen, because as a psychiatrist, I can't make that happen. I can't make that system give me more money. But if the court comes with me, I have a better chance of doing that without there being a bad outcome first.
I hear you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that experience with us. I have another question from Dr. Christopher Flynn. It's Dr. Patterson, your skills and accomplishments are incredible. You made it sound easy, but what strategies did you use to manage being a Black psychiatrist during a time of great racial discrimination?
Thank you for that question, Christopher. And I'm not sure of how easy I made it sound, but I will tell you there were some times, and my family would tell you sometimes, where it wasn't easy at all. The second 20 of traveling around the country and going into institutions, and I mean going into systems, meaning 6 or 8 or 10 prisons in the same state to see how they compare to each other, things like that. That's not easy stuff. And going into jails and seeing how overcrowded they were and not getting the kind of service they needed to get just to do basic triage. Those are terribly hard things to do. But I think in all retrospect, being a Black psychiatrist kind of helped me in that way, in the sense of realizing, yeah, some of this is not so different than outside. Some of the attitudes are not so different than outside. But I have an opportunity to do something that 20 years ago, 40 years ago, wouldn't have looked like me coming through here. So I'm not going to squander that opportunity by using advocacy in the wrong way at the wrong time. When you're in a jail or prison, you're trying really hard to do what you can for those patients and trying to get them to care. And sometimes you got to suck it up and know this is not how it's supposed to be. So you put it in writing. First, you have a conversation. Then you put it in writing with your upline supervisor. If you're in charge, you're the chief, then you go across to the correctional or carceral administrator and you say, look, we can't do our jobs the way we need to do our jobs unless you do something different. If you don't search people going on suicide watch before you put them in cell, we can't stop them from cutting themselves. We can't do, you have to do that. You have to help us do that. And it works for both of us. That's the verbal. Then it moves to putting in writing. We need X amount of this or that. And then it works up the line. If you're jumping around and yelling and screaming, you're not working there anymore. And how much good did that do for you? Now, that kind of jumping around and screaming advocacy has also got a place. It's got a place before legislators. It's got a place before the courts. It's got a place before the people who cut the dollars, the monies, the governors, not inside the jail, because inside the jail, the deputies and some of the jail personnel are feeling as bad as you are. They're there working 8 or 12 hours a day, just like you're being there, but they do it every day. So they've got their own issues too. And many times they will join with you once they know that you're not there just to kick their ass. You're there to say, look, we can do some things to make this better. What do you need? One of the questions I always ask, what do you need to do your job?
Thank you. And we have another question from Dr. Constance Dunlap. It says, Dr. Patterson and Dr. Mahideen, this has been quite informative and inspiring. Dr. Patterson, you've trained with the Giants, Dr. LaFall, Dr. Welsing, Dr. Robinson, and others. You model humility and respect for others. What can general psychiatrists do to prepare for court testimony, which we are called to do from time to time?
Well, that's a great question, Dr. Dunlap, and put it in this context. Keep in mind that many times the judges, and certainly some of the attorneys, but the judges that you may be testifying before don't know the law about mental health issues any better than you thought you did before you started studying for the case. So the most important things are first to know what the law is. What is the applicable law for the forensic question? When I say the forensic question, I mean, what is the court asking? Is the court asking, is this person competent to proceed in a criminal matter? Is the court asking, is this person criminally responsible / legally insane? In a civil matter, is the court asking, has this person suffered a trauma that would be causative of the symptoms that they are reporting? And are these symptoms causing harm and therefore impeding or causing them to suffer? Those are the court questions. So your focus for the general psychiatrist who was called to court is to keep that in mind. You also have to make sure to separate being a treating psychiatrist from an expert or opinion witness. We are opinion witnesses. We're going to give our opinion. We're different than fact witnesses. Fact witnesses are called to say what they saw, what they heard. Opinion witnesses are called because we are supposed to have particular expertise in a particular area. And we therefore can use hearsay. Fact witnesses can't do that. Fact witnesses can't say, well, Joe Blow told me and he told somebody else, and then that's how I got it. Nope. As an expert or opinion witness, we can. And we do it all the time because we review medical records. We talk to family members. We talk to victims. We talk to other people who have been involved with treatment. So we do that all the time. So it is knowing those parameters and knowing that the ultimate fact finder is the judge or the jury. So in court, for example, I am not allowed to say this person was insane when they did that. Insanity is a legal, not a medical determination. I am allowed to say at the time of the alleged offense, this individual was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct or unable to conform their conduct to the rule of law. That's what I can say. Now, what does that mean? If they're unable, it means they're insane. But I can't say that as an expert witness because I am not the person finding the actual verdict. That's up to the judge or the jury. So it is knowing your way around what this is about and trying to make sure that you keep your testimony focused on the forensic question. And if you happen to know a forensic psychiatrist somewhere, give us a call and we'll try to kind of help you out with what kind of case this is, because we're used to it. And it's unusual most of the time for a general psychiatrist.
Thank you for that advice. Our next question is from Dr. Anne-Marie Dietrich. Thank you, Dr. Patterson, for your ongoing service to some of our most vulnerable patients. Your dedication is so inspiring. How are you maintaining hope in today's current political environment?
Tough. I got to tell you that sometimes you got to set limits, right? The guy that I referenced a little while ago, Joe Henneberry, who was my first administrative boss after residency, used to have another saying, limit setting as a therapeutic tool. Okay. I have to set limits on myself. I cannot watch the media on either end, or even someone I don't usually watch for very long, because the pollution of it comes out with not just reporting news, but attempting to make news. And I grew up as a kid with my grandfather making me watch, and now I'm so glad he did, Walter Cronkite and people like that. And the ending of that show was, that's the way it is. The news, that's it. Here's the news, do what you want with it, compared to how it is now. And it is so difficult to try to get a clear picture of what actually is real. And remember, we're the realistic folks. We're supposed to be able to help people distinguish real from unreal. And there's so much that's out there that appears to be, and then it's not what it appears to be, or that people blatantly lie and then say, yeah, I lied, but I lied for a good reason, so it makes it okay. No, it's not. No, it's not. So yeah, for your own mental health, you got to figure out what you need to do for you. I am blessed to have an incredible wife who has supported me through all of this for 40, I don't even want to say how many years. Okay, 49 years. But I also have the rest of my family around me, and I cannot tell you what a joy that is to be able to see what is real. That's what's real. That's what does it. I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for all of us as well. And thank you again for your time, for answering all of our questions, for all of the lessons that you've shared with us today. I don't see any further questions. I know we're getting closer to the time when for the end of our podcast. So if anyone has any last minute questions, they can leave them in the chat. But otherwise, I'll thank you for your time.
Well, absolutely. And I appreciate being a part of this. This is important to me. And I would only end by saying that another thing that is very helpful, even a good shrink can use a good shrink when the time is right, right? So it really is one of those kinds of things where we need to talk to each other. Sometimes I have been inside of an institution with someone and we turn to each other and said, you cannot make this up. There's an expletive in there when we say it to each other because it is just that intense, but you can't make this up. Where did that come from? Now I see some hands here that went up. I don't know if they went back down.
They were giving you a round of applause, actually.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Clapping emoji.
I will give a round back. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's great.
Of course. Well, thank you again to all of you for joining us. And we hope to see you at our next podcast. Announcement will be sent shortly about who we'll be interviewing and who will be interviewed. Thank you all again. I think we'll sign off.